Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And as always, it is a pleasure and a privilege to rise in this House and contribute to the debate at second reading on Bill C-47, the Budget Implementation Act, Part 1. Now, Madam Speaker, I said it's a pleasure and a privilege to rise because it is always a pleasure and a privilege to rise and express the concerns of the people of Perth, Wellington. But while it's a pleasure and a privilege to rise, I am nonetheless disappointed and frustrated with this budget. Like many in this House, frankly, I feel like a case of déjà vu, because once again, Canadians were looking to this government for a budget that addressed their needs, and yet again, all we've seen from this government was another failed budget. Now, Madam Speaker, Bill C-47 is the first step in implementing parts of the flawed 2023 budget that the Minister of Finance presented on March 28th of this year. That budget, as presented, would produce a $43 billion deficit. And recently, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has said that that could balloon even higher to $45.1 billion. This from a government that has already driven up the national debt to nearly $1.5 trillion. So, Madam Speaker, let's take a walk down the deficit memory lane. Because what we see with this government is continuous overspending, spending more, and achieving less. March 31st, 2017, 1 year after the Liberals introduced their first budget, the national debt had already at that point climbed to $631 billion. A year later, it jumped up by $40 billion to $671 billion. By 2019, the year before the COVID pandemic, the national debt spiked to $685 billion. And then a year ago, the deficit had jumped to $1.13 trillion. And now in Budget 2023, the Minister of Finance is telling us that the national debt will reach $1.22 trillion by the end of this fiscal year. Now, Madam Speaker, this debt is a direct result of poor decision-making by this Liberal government. Only last November, the Minister of Finance rose in this place and told us the deficit for this year would actually be $30.6 billion. 5 months later, $40.1 billion. And in this budget, the cost of servicing the national debt is projected to nearly double to $43.9 billion. $43.9 billion just to pay the interest on servicing the national debt. That is $43.9 billion that is not going to the Canada Health Transfer. That is $43.9 billion that is not going to build better roads and bridges and wastewater treatment plants in Perth, Wellington, or in Simcoe Grey, or in any riding across this country. That is $43.9 billion that is not going to ensure that the Canadian Armed Forces have the equipment they need to do the important job that's asked of them. That is $43.9 billion that is not helping Canadians afford their rent or preventing poverty. And it's $43.9 billion that isn't going to fully implement the Canada Disability Benefit. All that $43.9 billion is going towards is the interest to wealthy bondholders on the national debt. Now, we've been told in the past that we just need to look at the debt to GDP ratio and that will continue to go down. But yet for this year and next year at least, it is once again going to be going in the opposite direction. In Budget 2022, the Minister of Finance promised that there would be a fiscal anchor. Well, that anchor has been dropped. For 8 years, we were told that this would be good, that we would see results from this deficit spending. But once again, we are seeing Canadians struggling to make ends meet. Now, Madam Speaker, if there's one topic that I hear time and time again in Perth, Wellington, it's housing. In every community in Perth, Wellington, where just a few years ago housing was affordable, they are now out of reach for what this government likes to call the middle class and those working hard to join it. My generation and younger, those under 40, are not seeing the hope that there once was of owning their own home. This government has created large, expensive programs without success. The National Housing Strategy has been a failure. The Housing Accelerator Fund has been a failure. The Canada Housing Benefit has been a failure. When it comes to affordable housing, the Liberal government has been a failure. And unfortunately, Bill C-47 will not address the growing problem of housing unaffordability. They promise one thing and deliver nothing. Now, Madam Speaker, like many members, we hear often from young families, from seniors, from folks who are trying to make ends meet. And they're telling us they can't afford their groceries. They're cutting back. They're making alternatives. They're skipping meals. But yet, what we see in this Liberal government is a failure to address the root causes of rising prices. Their ineffective and inefficient carbon tax is forcing Canadian families to pay more for less. Canada's Food Price Report predicts that a family of 4 will spend up to $1,065 more this year than just last year. That's after last year, it was an increase of nearly $1,100. And if the Minister of Finance was serious about reducing the cost of food for struggling Canadian families, there's an easy way to fix it, and that's to remove the carbon tax from all elements of food production. The carbon tax is served to make life more expensive, especially for lower income and working class Canadians. While higher income Canadians like the Prime Minister and others simply pay the tax and absolve themselves of any guilt for their excessive emissions, average Canadians cannot afford that. And every time Conservatives have proposed measures to reduce costs, Liberals have voted against it. Now, Madam Speaker, if we are looking at the roots of our food production system, we are looking at the agriculture and agri-food industry. And unfortunately, these Liberals fail to acknowledge that the high cost of groceries is their fault. From the rising costs on fertilizer, $34.1 million collected in tariffs, but none of that rebated to the farmers who paid those tariffs. The rising cost of fertilizer is making it more and more expensive for the farmers and farm families to grow the crops that quite literally feed our families, our country, and the world. But C-47 doesn't address that. It doesn't address a rebate for those farmers and farm families who paid those $34.1 million in tariffs. And it does not remove the cost of the carbon tax. Farmers need fuel to heat their barns. They need it to transport their crops. They need it to dry their grains. There are not alternatives for these measures. But sadly, the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food continues to side with the Prime Minister and his Finance Minister over the farmers and every other person along the food supply chain. From this, I can only conclude that either the Agriculture Minister isn't listening to farmers, or the Prime Minister and Finance Minister are not listening to this Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food. So, Madam Speaker, as I conclude, I want to reiterate that Budget 2023 has failed to address the real concerns of families in Perth, Wellington, and across Canada. After 8 years in office, this Liberal government and this Prime Minister have made life more and more unaffordable for Canadians. Now, with this budget, the Finance Minister expects to be congratulated for the benefits the government promises, despite the fact that those benefits don't even come close to matching the massive increases in prices caused by their inflation crisis. Madam Speaker, I will be voting no. I will be saying no more. Canadians can't afford any more of this Liberal government. I encourage all members to stand up for their constituents and vote against this failed Liberal budget. Thank you, Madam Speaker.